I found Doug Gibson's Across Canada by Story both entertaining and stimulating. Every so often, a word or a phrase would stand out and grab my attention. We even shared some similar experiences with some of the places and a number of the individuals. True, there are lots of exceptions, since I am not a Scottish immigrant, and my career as an editor or a publisher was brief, unless you count my website. Nobody would say that my pay grade at that occupation was exceptionally high. I do have a couple of university degrees, however. My main jobs occurred as an educator, from which I retired at the end of June in 1987 at 57 and quit smoking cold turkey on the following day. I live in Toronto with my wife Patricia when we are not traveling, which included a honeymoon in Brazil, Trinidad, and Tobago. We have 2 children, Jennifer and Robert. Doug Gibson and I met as directors of the Scottish Studies Foundation around 2009. My friend Ross-ter came to Toronto, Canada from Grangemouth, Scotland in the summer of 2004. Through him, I met Nola Crew, her husband Harold Nelson, and Janice Richardson, who were directors of the Scottish Studies Society, and I joined the Scottish Studies Foundation. That year I made a suggestion to Ross-ter, a director of the Scottish Studies Society, about using a clan passport to attract children, plus parents and relatives, to the clan tents at Scottish festivals. Shortly thereafter I met David Hunter and Jean Isley at their tent in Fergus, and I was invited to become a director of the Scottish Studies Foundation and the Scottish Studies Society. Doug Gibson has kept in touch with Rufus and Bea Churcher, who are now living in Vancouver. We visited Rufus and Bea at their Toronto home in 1991, and I mentioned some work cross-referencing my book, Our Ross Family Story. Rufus asked if I had any other literary work in progress, and I answered affirmatively, stating that currently it was truly a collection of words in search of a title. He chuckled and asked if he could use that comment on the essays of some of his students. Rufus told me that he had roomed with Norman Emerson, professor of anthropology and father of Ontario archaeology, when he first came to Toronto. We were discussing my undergraduate concentration in anthropology at the faculty club after Patricia's PhD ceremony. I repeat, it's a small world. The other Doug. Among the many books by John Preble published by Martin Secker and Waltberg Limited of London, The Highland Clearances stands as a powerful story about the penniless Scottish Highlanders evicted to make way for sheep. On page 325 of his Lion in the North, he wrote that the final voice of Scottish independence may be claimed by a native Highlander in 1854, when he told a southern proprietor looking for recruits on the ancient lands of his ancestors, "Since you have preferred sheep to men, let the sheep defend you." Preble's love affair with Scotland began when his parents moved to Saskatchewan in 1921 during the Depression. They lived in the Scottish township of Sutherland on the Saskatchewan River, where the brother of his father had settled earlier. His prairie experience influenced 2 of his books, The Buffalo Soldier, an historical novel about the American West, and Culloden, the story about 1746 battle, which resulted in the defeat of the mainly Jacobite uprising. His interest in the American West was also inspired by the fact that part of his family lineage was Native American, Cheyenne. Preble's first wife, Betty Golby, died in 1993, and he married his mistress and researcher of almost 50 years, Jan Reed, in 1994. His awards include FRSL in 1963 and OBE in 1998. I sought his assistance in 1972 when I began working on my own book, Our Ross Family Story, and he recommended that I contact Jan Reid. Upon completion of this tale, John kindly replied to my thank you letter, and I used all but the final sentence as a preface. As an aside to this, I must observe that Stephen Fry, British comedian, is a Jan Reid look-alike, in my opinion. Say hello to Mr. Norrie Fry. His statue on a bench at Victoria College, or University, is most lifelike and inviting. While I attended Victoria College, I took over the publication of the weekly Strands newsletter in my third year. I recall that Professor Northrop Fry held an occasional Writers' Club meeting to discuss and critique current works in progress. For my part, I had just typed a short story on a roll of paper, actually a scroll, involving a living, sentient planet being visited by astronauts from Earth. This was my first attempt at science fiction. I submitted the story to Norrie Fry at one of these meetings. He read it aloud, paused, and commented softly that it was a creative impression of a fictitious adventure, was it not? I responded that I intended it as a serious bit of science fiction, and that I would present a shorter version in December of 1953 to Elizabeth Harper, the editor of Acta Victoriana, who had been pestering me about handing over some of the contributions for the weekly Strands newsletter. The solid, ancient establishment just north of Queen's Park has changed since the 50s, when I studied anthropology in the lower-level classroom, or even since my wife had an office as an associate in the Department of Natural History during the 90s. The Hurrian Indian pot shards from Professor Norman Emerson's archaeological digs, and the bones of the zoo's African bush elephant, Tantor, exhumed from Professor Randolph Peterson's property, are stored there with dinosaur skeletons and Haida totem poles. My photographs are introduced by an inside view of the 2007 Daniel Libeskind entrance, inspired by the ROM's collection of gems and minerals, and named the Michael Leake Chin Crystal. Next is a Haida artist, Michael Wallace, in Ketchikan, who is shown with one of his totem carvings. My wife does not recall the photo taken in the vertebrate paleontology room when she worked as a technician and radiologist at the ROM. Finally, I just had to add Liz and Randolph Peterson, ROM bat expert, at a restoration site along the Great Wall of China in July of 1988 during a symposium of Asian Pacific mammalogy. Doug Gibson mentions the chambers of the Queen's official representative in Ontario, the Lieutenant Governor Jim Bartleman, the 27th person to be appointed to this position. He attended the 13th annual Tartan Day dinner on April 6, 2005, as a guest speaker when Doug Gibson received the Scott of the Year award. The Right Honourable James K. Bartleman spoke to the gathering about his friend Douglas Gibson. His honour was born on December 24, 1939 in Orillia, Ontario, and grew up in the town of Port Carling. As a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, royalties from his first book, Out of Muskoka, funded the National Aboriginal Achievement Foundation. I attended the New Year's levee of the Honourable Henry Newton Rowell Jackman, 25th Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, in 1992. In the first photo, I am showing Hal a collection of pictures from our days at the Burwash residence of Middlehouse. The stay in that residence receives little notice in his resumes. To top things off, I gave him a copy of a silly shot taken after a proper group photo in 1953. I could have added another taken in the Middle House common room during the same year when he was kibitzing during a game of bridge. Washakwanasine literally means he who walks by night. Grey Owl appeared at Massey Hall on March 26, 1938. 3,000 people listened attentively following the film about his beaver people, Jelly Roll, and Rawhide, as he stressed the need for conservation of the land, the trees, and the animals. My Aunt Fraser McPherson was interested in books and writers, and she felt that this program would be of interest to me. My 8th birthday was only 44 days away, and this event became a memorable present. With a mixture of youthful curiosity and fearlessness, I asked my aunt if it was possible to go backstage to meet him. She smiled and led me to the left-hand side of the stage, where a door opened to a stairway leading down to a basement level. She refused to accompany me further. At the bottom, I turned right, and there he was in his buckskin coat, no feathered headdress, twice as tall as I was, or more, and standing with 2 men in suits on either side. He noticed me and stepped forward. Hastily, I thrust my hand out to meet his. As I shook the hand of Grey Owl, I blurted out a thank you for his entertaining sermon. He and his entourage had a good laugh. I retreated back up the stairs, no autograph being requested. His books and his tours earned him a place of high honor, in spite of the fact that when he died on April 13, 1938, from pneumonia, Grey Owl was revealed to be Archie Bellany from Hastings, England, and, sob, a fraud. When I attended an event at the Arts and Letters Club in Toronto on April 10, 2013, I discovered that Grey Owl had been there in 1936. I would hasten to advise that, while beavers are cute and furry, they are wild animals, which can do a lot of damage. Fred Varley, January 2, 1881 to September 8, 1969, is well known as a founding member of the group of 7 artists. I was impressed by his specialization in portraits, the only member to do so. My encounter with Fred was while having a drink at the old KCR, King Cole Room, at the Park Plaza Hotel north of Victoria College in 1953, accompanied by a chum from the Middle House residence. Fred was less enthusiastic about the group's attention to the harsh Ontario wilderness, but did appreciate the Ontario landscape in comparison with the period in which he was commissioned as an official war artist during the First World War. I learned he found religion in nature, not the church. Margaret Atwood, a fellow graduate from Victoria College, is mentioned numerous times in Doug Gibson's book. Here is a photo of Margaret with the 2012 Scot of the Year, John Fraser. During the first presentation of the Penelope-ad, a feminist novella, in April of 2007, Margaret, Vic 1961, was a guest at the Victoria College Chancellor Council meeting. Another photo was taken of Margaret and my wife, Patricia, in Alumni Hall on that occasion.